Hey everybody, Donkey Storm here. I've been playing a lot of the Dragonflight beta, doing dungeons on all the healing specs, and since Blizzard recently announced they're more or less done making changes to the talent trees and are moving on to the tuning phase, I think now is a fair time for us to rate the gameplay of every healing spec. So keep in mind, this is a tier list of how the specs play and feel and the choices your talent trees offer, but since tuning is not done yet, it's not a tier list of what's best. We just don't know that yet. So let's jump right in and see if we can get to each spec in under 2 minutes. There we go. Let's start with the pre-specs, beginning with Holy. If you like Holy in Shadowlands and you didn't just play it because it was crazy good and overtuned, you'll probably still like it in Dragonflight. The healing rotation feels better, with the Flash Concentration Legendary being replaced by Light Weaver, which feels much less cumbersome to maintain. With this talent, you're basically switching back and forth between Flash Heal and getting the same effect as Flash Concentration gave. You're also a bit more incentivized to use things like Prayer Mending, so I do feel like the healing rotation in general has improved. Also, from a DPS standpoint, many talents synergize with Holy Fire, and it actually feels like Holy Priest has some identity now from a damage dealing perspective. Unfortunately, the whole spec feels a bit stripped down when it comes to utility, and that's particularly bad since Priest was already lacking in the utility department as it is. We lost Fey Guardians, so no damage reduction for others, no cooldown reduction for our party, and Shining Force, with nothing to show for it, and it's also the only healing spec along with Disc Priest with no interrupt, and the overall kit feels like it's lacking. Also on the defensive front, we've gained basically nothing. We had a really cool talent that would essentially have been a cheat death after Guardian Spirit ended, but they decided to get rid of that and instead give us the chance to battle res someone else when we die, which is a tremendous downgrade. Because of all this, despite some positive changes, I can't take Holy any higher than B tier. Next up, let's take a look at Resto Druid. Resto Druid has a ton of carryover from Shadowlands as far as talents go, and you'll find yourself taking either Feral or Balance Affinity route that will also affect your choice of either Convoke or Adaptive Swarm. Yep, even though it takes about 20 talents to achieve instead of 4 or 5, it's essentially the same two playstyles and talents. There are some parts of the Druid talent tree that I find a little maddening, like needing to spend 1 point to get Sunfire and another to make it do its AoE that it's always done, or the fact that Feral and Balance Affinity basically still exist but are just spread across 8 talents instead of 1, but on the bright side, the spec feels really good to play. You'll still be getting Skull Bash added to your kit. You have the choice of whether or not you want to play double Life Bloom style or retain your Sepulchral Tree of Life tier bonus. But honestly, of all the healing specs, Druid feels the most copy-paste from Shadowlands of any of them. As a current fan of Resto Druid on Live, I'm okay with that, and I've still found the Feral Affinity Adaptive Swarm playstyle is really fun and rewarding. So all that said, there's not a ton of new stuff coming to Druid, but I do feel like it's a complete A-tier spec. Okay, so what everyone's probably been waiting for, Preservation Evoker. I've gone back and forth and hemmed and hawed about my feelings on this spec, and after playing it a boatload, it's going in the S tier, guys. I'm sorry, it's fun, and I'm tired of pretending it's not. The biggest tell there is for me is that whenever I went over to play any other spec to test it out, my immediate want was to just go back and play more Evoker, and at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. That's why we're here, guys. The playstyle is unique, it's fast-paced, it's got a tool for every situation, a ton of utility, simplistic but satisfying way of dealing damage, especially AoE, and I'm just kind of addicted to Preservation right now. And the more time I spent on it, the more I learn how to manage things like echoes, get the most out of cooldowns. This spec just keeps getting more interesting, and I can't wait to see what it's capable of when we get exposed to some more challenging content. So don't get me wrong, the spec is not without its flaws. Something about the empowerment system still feels a little bit wonky. Having limited range is a pain at times. I'm still not convinced that the tools we're given to compensate for the limited range is going to be enough to truly overcome it. Yes, it kind of sucks you can only play it as one particular race, but I'm not going to deny it anymore. Fun is fun, Preservation is S tier. Let's talk about Resto Shaman. I really like what was done with the Shaman talent tree. It feels like there was a lot of attention to detail, and it actually feels like one of the trees with the most meaningful choices of all the healing specs. While overall, Shaman plays a lot like a Shadowlands version with a lot of Riptides and a lot of healing surges going out, plus the potential to keep your tier set bonus if you choose to talent into it. The changes are really in the margins, with new wrinkles like having Windrush Totem, Acid Rain, Stormkeeper, Ancestral Guidance, the return of Primordial Wave. I just feel like Shaman has a talent for everything, and the spec feels so solid and complete all around. It's hard to imagine it not being a top contender when the expansion is released. I do miss Vesper Totem, as that was a really fun ability to play with, but I think there's enough baked into the Resto talent tree that you're going to forget about it pretty quickly. Resto's going to have a load of keybinds, that's for sure, but it's got a really solid healing kit, good damage potential, and an ever-increasing amount of utility that is going to leave it somewhere near the top of the heap when Dragonflight's released. I think Resto Shaman is really the blueprint for how to take a solid healing spec on live and update it without watering it down. S-tier spec behind Evoker. So Holy Paladin has been a very controversial spec, and a lot of trash has been talked about it ever since the Dragonflight talents were announced. And while I think there is some merit to what's been said, I also feel like it's been overstated just a bit. Yes, I agree with the many people who have said that Holy should just be designed as a melee healer, and that talents designed to make it a ranged healer would be better spent just offering more choice to the melee player. I'm 100% down with that. But having spec'd my Paladin melee and actually run it through several dungeons, guys, the spec still feels fine. It's very similar to the current Shadowlands version of Paladin on live, but imagine that plus running 2 Covenants side by side with Divine Toll and Blessing of Seasons, while also getting things like Bestow Face, Light's Hammer, all together. You still got a lot of utility as always, plus the added benefit of a battle res, so while I agree the talent trees are pretty wonky, fortunately it doesn't ruin the Holy Paladin melee playstyle, which is still very much intact. Unfortunately, what we've really got here is an example of the old saying, when you try to please everyone, you please no one. And because of that, while the spec plays solid enough, there's just so much room for improvement here, I'm sticking it in the B tier. Okay, let's get into maybe the most hyped up healing spec over the last few weeks, and that's Mistweaver Monk. People are in love with this spec, and for good reason. It's a load of fun, and it actually fulfills the do damage to do healing profile really nicely. The talent tree feels well designed for this purpose as well, and yes, it was a lot of fun getting my hands dirty in melee range and whacking stuff to keep my group alive. I have some concern about the viability of that in endgame content, but that's really not what this tier list is about. Just something to keep an eye on for later. The facts are this: Mistweaver has some nice utility, it's a really well designed melee healer spec like Paladin probably could have been. Anytime you're forced out of melee, however, the spec understandably can really fall behind in the healing department, and also I actually had more issues with spread out healing and healing range on this spec than I did on Preservation Evoker, which was surprising, but damn it if it wasn't fun. Actually doing good damage and feeling like it's contributing to your healing, sign me up. It's a blast to play and absolutely going in the S tier. Disc Priest has undergone quite a few changes since Shadowlands. Your ability to apply atonements is a lot more interesting now, as instead of just spamming shields on everyone, you can use things like Renew and Flash Heal to apply atonement. In your talent tree, you have a lot of choice as to whether or not you want to spec heavily into damage and shadow abilities or go more of the shield and absorb route. All this seems to be focused on making Discipline the ranged version of what Mistweaver Monk is, a battle healer. Honestly, the difference is fun in my mind, and it just comes down to the simplicity of Mistweaver Monk versus the complexity of Disc Priest. On Mistweaver Monk, I could just kind of happily punch and kick my way through dungeons and keep my group alive with relative ease, while on Disc, applying and maintaining atonements as well as timing them correctly and using my bursts at the right time felt like more of a chore, made even more cumbersome by the fact that there are so many buttons that seemingly have little synergy with one another. While the gameplay is a lot more dynamic than Holy, it's also a lot less intuitive, and while I know Discipline has long held the title of most difficult healer, at times it just felt complex for complexity's sake. And since Discipline also suffered from the same update that stripped Holy of its utility, it's hard for me to place it anywhere than the B tier when compared to the other healing specs. Alright, so that's my impression of every healer so far in the Dragonflight beta. To be honest with you, I'm pretty happy with healers across the board, and I feel like even the so-called lower tier ones are pretty solid, and I'm excited that with the new talent system, our characters are actually going to feel unlocked when we hit max level this time around. So what are your guys' opinions on the spec so far? I'd love to hear from you in the comments section. Just let me know what you think. Again, just remember this is not an endgame best spec in the game tier list. It's just the fun and gameplay I experienced with each spec. As always, if you want to see more Dragonflight healer content, subscribe to the channel or check out my stream right here on YouTube, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 9 p.m. Pacific. Happy healing.